echo that, so thank you. I don't think I really need the mic, to be honest, unless you need it for that. Okay. So my name is Ted Adams, and it sounds like you met Chris Pitzer. We met in 91, I guess, at Eclipse Comics. And for both of us, it was our first job working in comics. I had just graduated college in 1990, and I applied for an ad in the Comic Buyer's Guide. Back, for those of you that are, some of you are too young to know the Comic Buyer's Guide, but it was a weekly publication, newsprint publication, at least in that era, that you got primarily through subscription, and it was a combination of news and ads. And so for those of us that were in fandom in that era, sort of the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, it was one of the places where you would go to find out about comics. And so, it wasn't like the world is today where you can find everything online. So anyhow, Eclipse ran an ad for a distribution manager, and I had just graduated college, and I sent them a resume. And I was living in Ashland, Oregon, which is just on the other side of the Northern California border. And Eclipse at the time was in a town called Forestville, which is near Santa Rosa, California. So I drove down. I was an enormous comics fan, had been my entire life. And Kat and Dean were really like idols. Like they were a big deal for me. The idea that I would get to meet these people that were publishing the comics I was reading, not just meet them, but interview for a job was truly kind of unbelievable.
Damn it, Bruce.
So I interviewed the job and got it. And then I worked there for a couple of years, and Chris joined. You want to show your you want to show your portfolio?
I'm glad you told me that story just now, because that was going to be my question after we showed the portfolio, because this is my origin story,
right?
And now I know yours, which I never knew until now. Awesome.
There's not much of a story other than just.
Well, no, I didn't know there was an ad in CBD.
It was just this idea, and and looking back at 1990. For those of you old enough to remember, but to get from Ashland, Oregon to Forestville in 1990 was that I didn't just look at my phone, right? I was 21 years old. I had lived in Southern Oregon my whole life. I had very little life experience. I got in my car and figured out a way to drive to Santa Rosa and figure out how to get to their house. Like, it's just such a different thinking about that. And then this idea that I was going to essentially meet my heroes was, it was really extraordinary.
So almost like Ted, I had just gotten out of college. We had a snowstorm. I was in West Virginia. And because of this snowstorm, I went about creating a portfolio. And this is what I'm going to run through these relatively quickly. So this is a little box. I had a fascination with cogs at the time. So this would have been slides, illustration, posters, design, logos, and some brochures, really crappy stuff done in Corel Draw on a PC, and a postcard. Because if you send somebody something to look at, you want a response. Back then, you didn't have, there were emails, but I didn't have an email. So I sent a post.
I don't think there were emails in 1990.
Well, people in federal government might have had email. Yeah. So Kat sent me this postcard back, essentially saying, "We love this box. It's amazing. What are your goals? Do you want to freelance? Do you want a permanent position? We have people here already. We're looking for an editor. And here's the number if you want to talk about it." So I called him up. I said, "Hey, thanks for getting back to me. I sent Eclipse a box. I sent Fantagraphics a box, and Dark Horse a box. Eclipse was the only one to respond." And I called, and we talked a little bit, but essentially this. And then 2 weeks go by, and Stan Walk, who is the current production guy, wants to leave and get back to drawing comics. He's like, "Are you still interested?" I was like, "Yeah." So my girlfriend at the time, we put all our belongings in boxes on a pallet, had it shipped out to California, then drove out. And I met Ted my first day, and you took me to the diner, and I had my first French dip sandwich. You bought, so thank you.
See,
he jumped on it before Dean did, so appreciate that.
I was worldly before you, I guess, there, huh? Okay, so let's talk about Jan and Dean, because you're not here to learn about me and Chris. Right. So this is Surf City. So Jan and Dean, surprisingly, was a name of a rock act as well that I don't know a whole lot about, but Jan and Dean kind of played into that. The fact that they had the same names as what were at the time a well-known band. And Jan's background is music. So he had a love of music and had a career in music. Dean was the comics fan. And so Dean grew up in comics fandom. He was part of that late 60s comics scene, living in New York City or near New York City, I think in one of the boroughs. And so he was there in those early days when fans were starting to organize through meeting each other through letters columns, meeting in those early conventions, those first New York conventions, the Phil Suling conventions. And this is a time, also an era when other people like Roy Thomas, Paul Levitz, other people of that era who went on to have big careers in comics, this is where they were all organizing. And it's when the comics fandom, when the comics publishing business started to transition from people who had been professionals in publishing, primarily people who had done pulp magazines that had moved into publishing and other kind of publishing. This is the era when the fans start to take over the publishing companies. So Roy Thomas is at Marvel, Paul Levitz is at DC, Dean Mullaney is starting Eclipse, Gary Groth, who was also part of that scene, starting Fantagraphics. So it's comics fandom starting to become the people who are running the comics business. And there are some good things about that, but there are some bad things. One of the bad things is that this is also an era when comics, you have to remember at this point in time, comics were sold on newsstand. There were no direct market stores. Phil Suling had not yet quite started the direct market. And so when the fans take over, there's this transition where the content that they're creating is not necessarily appealing to that broad audience that you have to reach through newsstands. And newsstand sales only work if there is a significant sell-through percentage because it's sold on a returnable basis. So this is kind of that era when things are changing for comics, and the comics are starting to be made for fans more than they are necessarily for that mass audience of kids. And Dean Mullaney is starting to get to meet creators. So we're talking about late 70s. He meets Don McGregor and Paul Gulacy and decides, with the help of Jan, who at this point had established a career musician, so he had some money. So Jan was kind of the money behind the scenes. And he goes to, I think Dean's story is that he met Don and Paul, the creators of this book, at a party. And they were bitching about, they were very having a relatively successful careers, both of them at Marvel Comics. And, but they weren't happy with their publisher, as often is the case, right? I can tell you as a longtime publisher, creators are often not happy with their publisher. And so they were complaining about, one of the things they were complaining about, of course, is that they did not own their creations. So Don was doing Black Panther and other things. He, of course, didn't own those characters. I think Paul around this time was doing Master of Kung Fu, the Shang-Chi character, didn't own those characters, didn't even get royalties at this point in time. This is before Marvel and DC were paying royalties. So they're getting, page rates, and they're not happy about it, rightfully. So Dean, who had was working in accounting, he had a very straight job in New York City as an accountant, was not happy, knew he didn't want to do that, loved comics, decided with Jan's help that they would take a gamble and publish this book called Saber. And so this is one of the early graphic novels. There are other graphic novels. Will Eisner's Contract with God preceded this book. But the difference is Will, who had been publishing with Kitchen Sink and had a relationship with Kitchen Sink, when Will published Contract with God, he very personally didn't want a comic book publisher. So he went to a book publisher because he wanted to be sold in bookstores. He wanted his book to be taken seriously. Unfortunately, at that period of time in the early to mid 70s, there wasn't much hope of that.
Which publisher?
We only have 10 minutes left?
Speed it up, Ted.
We just started. I don't think you're right.
I think we were supposed to end at 3:50, right? Wait a minute, we go to 4:30, don't we? Yeah. Okay, we got like.
I don't think I can do this in 10 minutes. Okay.
Love it.
Right.
Love it.
Okay.
I wanted to see you do it 10 minutes. Well, who was the publisher for Contract? Was it?
I think it was a company. I don't remember.
Yeah, it
started
was a
with
beautiful.
Baronet.
That's
yeah,
it.
thank
It was
you.
a beautiful looking book.
Yeah, beautiful book,
Find a
but
copy.
but they didn't know what they were doing, and
Right.
and the book was confusing for bookstores. There were, of course, no graphic novel sections. The idea you would sell a comic book in a bookstore was absurd in that era. It got racked in the religious section. It didn't sell at all the way Will hoped. So anyhow, I think you can make the argument. There are lots of other books that you can make the argument are the first graphic novel. You can look at the Lynn Ward books. You can look at It Rhymes with Lust. There are all kinds of people who have dabbled with original graphic novels through the history of comics publishing. But this, I think you can make the argument, is the first creator-owned graphic novel, standalone story that was sold to the direct market. Because by this time, Phil Suling had started buying from publishers and selling to comic stores. And you have people like the Shanis brothers in California doing Pacific distribution, eventually starting Pacific Comics. This is all of this era. So Eclipse Comics is starting with Saber, and as we're going to see, went on to be a vibrant publishing company. But they were certainly right at the forefront of original graphic novels and absolutely at the forefront of creator ownership. These are things that we completely take advantage, for granted here in 2024, right? If you're a creator and you're working for, a Boom Studios or an Image, that creator ownership is just something that you're going to take for granted. But that was all established through publishers like Dean and Jan, who was his partner in this. And one of the things that is cool to me about that is these are entrepreneurs who are taking a financial risk. Dean put his accounting career on hold. Jan put his own money. He wasn't a rich man. He was just making a reasonable living. They put that at risk to be able to do these kinds of things. And so we're going to look at a few things about why Eclipse is important, but this is really the start of it. And part of the reason why Chris and I are doing this book is obviously we love Eclipse because we work there.
Love-ish.
I think I don't have as good a memory as Chris, so I
nostalgia, maybe.
Yeah. But I do. But we are trying to sort of like get the word out on some of the things that Jan and Dean, and we're going to talk about Kat Ironwood as well, who was also an important part of this. So, what do you got next, Chris?
Well, I mean, sadly, this was back when you only had film and cameras, right? You didn't have a camera in your phone. So I have maybe 6 or 8 photos of my time in Eclipse. And so this is actually Eclipse offices. There was like a grapevine arbor that went to their Victorian house.
Yeah.
And it was a really beautiful office to work in. And so very few photos. I just wanted to share them with you since I have you here.
So the office before this preceded. So
right. Talk about that. Yeah.
So Jan and Dean, they had success with Saber. It did okay. It's not like they got rich from it, but they did okay from it. It certainly validated that this was potentially a realistic business. And so they started to do a little more. They did a magazine called Eclipse Magazine, which was an anthology, creator-owned anthology. Again, very unique for its time. Mike Friedrich had been doing Star Reach and had done something similar. Important to recognize him because he was also early in that creator-owned space, doing direct market publications. So they did Eclipse Magazine. That became a comic book called Eclipse Monthly. They're starting to do some other works, things that spun out of the Eclipse Magazine and Eclipse Monthly. And around this time, we're talking like early 80s at this point. So, a few years have gone by, and they're starting to realize that this potentially could be a way to make a living. Kat Ironwood enters the story, and Kat is she wasn't, I don't think you could say that in the early days that she was necessarily in love with comics in the way that Dean was and Roy and Paul and some of those other folks, but she certainly she loved Doctor Strange, and she she loved the Spirit specifically. She really went out of her way to track down the Spirit newspaper inserts, which were of course hard to find. And so she definitely had a love of comics, but she entered the scene a little bit later than sort of the other guys did. And she was living in the Bay Area, and she, again, some of this stuff is a little bit apocryphal, and I do want to make that clear that not some of this is stories and things that I've learned, and so it's not necessarily that I have it out of Kat's mouth exactly how some of these things went down, but in some way, and Kat, as you saw with Chris's postcard, she was a really prolific writer, and she was, we'll talk about this a little bit, but she was very willing to share every detail of her life. And so...
especially when I walked into work one day and there was a 2-page letter in that tiny red handwriting telling me everything I was doing wrong.
Yeah,
I wish I would have kept that letter.
Right. I got one of those too.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
So I got one. I guess if we're going to tell I didn't know we were going to tell those kind of stories, but I will tell mine. So one of my jobs was I was in charge of they had a monthly publication called the Eclipse Extra, and my job was to put the copy together for that. So I would call up the creators, hey, what's happening in Zot number 9, et cetera. I would write those down, and then I would write them. This predates modern publishing, so this is a very old-fashioned way of doing these things. I would write my copy, I'd present it to Kat, and then she would have her red pen. And I had been doing this for many months, and the criticism had been fair. She was pointing out typos and things. She's a very good proofreader.
She was editor-in-chief, so yeah.
Yeah. So, although there's a lot of mistakes in the Eclipse books, as I've gone back to read them, it's kind of surprising to me how riddled with mistakes they are. But this one time, she just wrote a bunch of really personally mean things on this letter in a red pen. And I was a young guy. I was 22, and I have thin skin. And so I walked into Dean's office and I said, "Yeah, I quit." I was making $18,000 a year when I worked at Eclipse, so I had no backup. I moved to California, but I was so mad. I walked in, I was like, "I quit." I walked out, got my car, drove off, and Dean eventually convinced me to come back. But that actually was kind of the writing on the wall for me. But to go back to Kat's story a little bit, so she worked for a guy named Ken Pierce, and Ken Pierce was doing strip reprints before anybody else. And he was doing things like Modesty Blaze, which was a UK strip. He was doing AXA, some other things. And so Kat was working as an editor for Ken Pierce. So she was working in comics at this point, and she met Dean. And I don't have the story of their romance, but they became romantically involved. And she would eventually become the editor-in-chief at Eclipse. Dean would move into a publishing role. Jan was a little bit exited from the company at that point, but still, I think, involved from a financial perspective.
And back on the East Coast.
And so they moved. So Dean had been in the New York area. They moved to Guerneville, California. And so that's where the first Eclipse office was. And they were in that location for quite some time. There was a terrible flood, a once-in-a-lifetime flood in Guerneville.
The Russian River.
The Russian River flooded. And the Russian River is actually an Airboy story that if you buy our book, you'll learn about.
And we went camping on the Russian River.
There. Yeah, no, it's a good segue for sure. So the office that Chris showed you was actually their second office.
Yeah.
And so the Guerneville office was flooded. That was, my understanding, was a more traditional office building. So they weren't living essentially where they lived. It was a more traditional kind of office. It was flooded. And this was a really bad time, obviously, for Eclipse, because they were a very small organization. Not all their backstock, but significant amount of their inventory was destroyed, which is why some Eclipse books are hard to find, because they were just quite literally, ruined. Film was destroyed, so they couldn't use the film to sell the foreign rights. It was a really almost catastrophic period of time.
He lost some jukeboxes too.
Yeah, all kinds of stuff. I mean, it was a true once in a lifetime kind of flood. The city wasn't ready for it, so they moved to Forestville, which they at this point realized they looked at the floodplain maps to figure out where is going to be safe. They bought a house, as Chris said, an old Victorian.
Yeah.
Although I don't know if houses. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But and then the building that Chris showed you is where we worked. And so
this is the interior of the production area.
Yeah.
So that would have been the far right corner. Ellen Brinkley?
I don't remember her. So.
And then she changed her name to Susan and moved to Missouri or something.
Okay.
After she left. But when she saw the 2-page red, tiny handwriting letter, she just lost it. And I was like, take the day off. You're done. Just go cool down. But interestingly enough, this old drafting table I found in Pennsylvania and shipped out to Dean. It took a couple months for him to remember to pay me for it. But yeah, production. So a lot of flat files back there. This is cool. Color chart. How you build your color back in the day by hand, percentages. Just stuff everywhere.
You can see here. See, but this is
the trading card
box sets. And so later in Eclipse's history, again, being entrepreneurial, Dean, I think it was probably more Dean, although Kat could have been involved as well. She certainly was involved in the political ones. They would do these box sets of trading cards. They had 36 trading cards in a box, and they would typically be a scandal. So the Iran-Contra scandal or the savings loan scandal, things that are probably forgotten for a modern audience, but these were of the moment. And they would get really good artists. Bill Sienkiewicz did a set, and they would do paintings, and then the back of the card would tell the story of this scandal. And again, this was them being innovative, not something that had been done before. That then morphed into doing traditional trading cards, foil packed and wax packed cards, and they did a number of licensed cards. The thing that they did that was the most controversial was they did a set of serial killer trading cards, sold in wax packs.
I remember.
Yeah, and this was highly controversial. This was before the days of.
I think were you already gone when they came out?
Yes.
So Ted was already gone, and I think they came out, and I was out the door because I remember by the time I made it back to the East Coast, Jan, I believe, was on like the Maury Povich show.
Yeah, so it got real national media attention. It was very controversial. It was it was before true crime was. People had interest in true crime, of course. I think probably for the history of humankind, there's been interest in crime, right? But
to sell it to
present,
kids.
but to present it this way, and that's the issue, right? Because it was this idea that it was being marketed to kids. They legitimately weren't really marketed towards kids, but that, of course, from a mass media standpoint, there's a story to be told there, controversy to be raised. And they leaned into it. Dean reveled in it. I've had conversations with him about it. Yeah, I would have hated it. That to me would have been. I don't like people saying mean things about me and in my companies, and so well, first of all, I just wouldn't have done it because I would have known that. But Dean liked it. He liked it. It sold more cards. They did a true crime. They did a true crime set. They did a set of
and to their point, they also did like AIDS awareness set.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
everything they were doing.
The Iran-Contra set was providing a service. It was presenting that information in a way that could be easily understood. So if you want, the savings and loan scandal in that era was a complex financial scandal. They presented it in a set of 36 trading cards that was much easier than if you're going to read the article in the Wall Street Journal. So, but on the true crime, so they also did a set that I like that most people have forgotten. Is they did a set of courtroom drawings. So working with one of the courtroom artists, I forget the cases, but they found famous cases, and then they would present those as well. And so
was that a box set?
I need to dig. I haven't dug into that for the research yet. I need to dig into a little bit more. But my memory is, which could be faulty, is that it was a wax set.
Okay, wow.
Or a foil set.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So you get some other folks too, right? That we.
So Valerie Jones. Back on that postcard, Kat said they were looking for editor. That was the editor that ended up coming there. And I remember she edited the Miracle Man comic.
Yeah, so Val, I forget her background exactly, but she had worked in comics. Yeah. This is obviously a time now we're talking like early 90s, so Eclipse has expanded. They've hired people like me and Chris. They've got Val. So the editorial team is expanding. They did go through a lot of editors, which maybe since you've heard some of our stories,
and production people,
you might get a sense of why that was. But
she brought the Born to Be Wild project.
Born to Be Wild, yeah, she's a good editor, and she's fun to work with. So I have fond memories of Val for sure.
And then one of the projects I had at Eclipse was to make this Reed Fleming stand up. Back in the day, you went to like photocopies and you paste all these photocopies together and color it. And David Boswell, it was an event up in Canada. I can't believe we shipped this thing to Canada.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. But it's just
let's talk about Reed for a minute. Yeah. So because I think it's cool that so Reed Fleming, as Chris said, is created, written, and drawn by David Boswell, and he self-published it. So he was essentially this was post Underground Comics, but it was in the spirit of Underground Comics. The sensibility of it certainly is. They could have been published in the late 60s as part of a rip-off press title or a last gasp title. But he self-published it in Canada. I don't know how Dean and Kat found out about it, but this is one of the cool things about Eclipse is, and one of the things they taught me as a publisher is that follow your passion. You're going to do the things that are going to make you some money. Eclipse will do licensed things. They'll do James Bond comics. They'll do The Hobbit. Things that are they know are going to make that money, but this wasn't just about the money for them, and that's unusual in publishing sort of period. You certainly see that spirit at a show like CXC, but if you go to Comic-Con, it's about the commerce. It's typically about pitch books for movies, right? So I did a lot of this myself. Yeah.
I heard he lost the rights to the character.
No, I don't think that's true because I republished this at IDW as a hardcover. What you might be referring to, and I don't know.
There's some potential movie deal.
Yeah, he may have. He certainly didn't lose the publishing rights because I published the book myself fairly recently.
Did you republish Fun with Reed Fleming?
I don't remember exactly what the contents were, but it was. But I suspect that was in there. It was comprehensive. So yeah, I would think so. He did do a lot of movie rights.
Maybe the deal was like Warner Brothers couldn't. Maybe it's just he couldn't take it to another studio.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. When you do a
complication where
right.
He couldn't do what he wanted to do with the character after a while because he signed some contract.
Okay. I don't know, to be honest with you, but it would be surprising because that's not typically the case with movie deals. You certainly can't do a movie deal and then do another movie deal until that one ends. But it would be unusual for them to tell you that you couldn't do publishing. But I just want to put a point on this that this is Kat and Dean and Jan to a certain extent, Bruce Pally, who was an accountant for them, Bo Smith, who was the VP of their sales. This is a small group of people who are passionate about comics and doing what they love here. They're taking the money from things that make the money, and they're putting it into things that may or may not make money. I don't know if Reed Fleming made money. My suspicion is no, but they didn't just put the money in their pockets. They're putting the money in they're giving the money to creators to do these kinds of projects, and I think that's an important. They're a little early in that as well. If you look at certainly the early history of comics, all the way up into the 70s, these are entities that are just they're only doing it for the money. If you look at the guys that came out of the pulp magazines, the Donenfelds, the Goodmans, the Archie families, like this wasn't about the love of comics. This was about the love of dollar bills, right? And so this is a transition. And I'm not saying Eclipse is the only one. In this era, there were specific comics, there were Hispanic Graphics, there's Comico, there's other publishers that are doing similar. But I think this is a good example of.
And your point about following your passion, I remember Dean telling me one time to go through the slush pile. Did you ever go through the slush pile?
I don't remember if I did.
And I pulled things out and I said, I think these are good.
Right.
And those creators might have made it into an anthology later on.
Yeah.
But fun with Reed Fleming, the first book I got to design at Eclipse. So for this, at least for the ashcan, it is half toned out on the cover. little trivia thing there. Second secretary I recall being at Eclipse. Looks like she's giving me the finger. She probably did not want her photograph taken. The only trivia thing I remember is that we bought her a Sandman slipcase as a birthday gift, and she loves Sandman. And then I think that slipcase was like kind of rare and out of print or something.
I'm sure it is.
Yeah, it was a big deal.
I don't think I've worked with her.
Dean's butt as he gets money out of the ATM. Oh yeah, there's Kat, Dean.
Yeah,
Well, I didn't take this photo, but Dean gave it to me for some reason.
So I wish we had a better picture of Kat. That's Kat.
I might have cropped it this way.
Yeah, if we do this again, we definitely need to get a better picture of Kat. But this is Clyde Barker.
Yes.
You see him wearing an Eclipse hat. And so Clyde Barker is an example of where the commerce and the art kind of intersect, because Clyde Barker at this point in time, this would have been, again, the early 90s, because I was working there. So we're looking at like 91 probably. Clyde Barker was red hot as an author. He had published a series of books called The Books of Blood. His Hellraiser movie had just come out. He was as hot as you can be. And this is an era when authors could be hot. This was a time when there were celebrity authors, and he was one of them.
And very kind to the fans.
Unbelievable human being. I've worked with a lot of creators. I don't know that I've worked with ones who are as kind as him, but never one who was more kind. He was, as Chris said, he went out of his way. But this is important for Eclipse because now they've got a hot author, and this is really commercial. And so they're doing adaptations of his Books of Blood story in an anthology called Tapping the Vein, which was commercially very successful. They did a die-cut cover for one of those issues, which is, if not the first time that had been done, certainly one of the first times. They were bringing on really good artists. So we're talking about people like Scott Hampton, Bo Hampton, Craig Russell, Klaus Janson. Steve Niles is doing some of these adaptations, and so these are top-notch creators adapting these stories, and they're effective. They hold up to today. Some of those, it became so successful that some of the Books of Blood stories were then published on their own. So things like Son of Celluloid was published by itself, Dread was published by itself, Revelations, Yattering and Jack was done by John Bolton, which is a
beautiful book,
published both in a trade paperback and a hardcover. Another thing that was, I don't know that they necessarily innovated, but certainly they normalized, which was the idea that you would do a trade paperback and a hardcover. They also did signed and numbered hardcovers with dust jackets. So they would typically do trade paperback, a hardcover where they cut out the trade paperback cover and glued it onto the hardcover, very old-fashioned publishing. And then they would do a version that had a dust jacket. And that version, they would be signed and numbered. This was predated the time when you could bind into the book the tip-in plate, so the tip-in plate would be glued onto the front page, or there would be a piece of cloth that would be bound into the book and it would be glued onto there. So if you buy, I just bought a Sacred and Profane that we just found 2 days ago. That's a signed copy that I didn't have. Because the tip-in plate is glued onto this piece of paper, it's not bound in. They become defective, and so the glue wrinkles over time. And so, there, if you're, I'm luckily not a condition collector, but if you are, there are no perfect copies of those. So.
And every now and then, you'd have a bunch of tip-ins you need to get done, and you'd just put them up on a huge sheet of paper that the printer would run off.
Yeah.
Just production-wise, interesting. Is that Miracle Man 15 back there, by the way?
It's
Do you know?
Airboy 1. That's
No.
that's not 15.
Okay.
I couldn't tell you what it is, but it's not 15.
Dave Stevens, Mr. Monster poster, Dinosaurs Attack.
So this is Dean. Also, we should point out, Dean was always
well-dressed
a
man.
real snappy dresser, and was today. You know, when we published him at IDW and we would go to Eisner Awards, Dean was always, you know, the best dressed man in my opinion. He thought a lot about his clothes. He thought a lot about his appearance.
I remember somebody was pulling a prank on him by saying, Todd McFarlane's the guy in the green suit, and it was Dean. So all these kids kept coming up. It was like an Oakland show.
Yeah, that's funny. So, but Dean, I do want to Dean was really serious about what he was doing. He very rarely spoke off the cuff about, he's a very serious guy. He took his job seriously. He took his book seriously. He was, and I think for him, part of that was, this is me putting my own thoughts onto Dean, but that part of dressing up in the suit and looking nice was like, he wanted to be taken seriously. And I did take a little bit of that as a publisher. I will say, like, it drove me crazy. I guess I should have said before. I had other publishing jobs. I worked for Jim Lee. I worked for Todd McFarlane, and then I started IDW and ran that for 20 years. So, I have a long career as a publisher, and much of what I learned from Dean. And one of the things that made me crazy in comics would be like, you'd see the, I shouldn't name names, but like you'd see the publisher of DC Comics in like a T-shirt, you know, at Comic-Con. And I was like, come on, like. I would at least wear collared shirts. I felt like, you know, if you're going to be the business person representing the company, like, you know, ditch the T-shirt, right? So, anyhow, what else we got?
This was now, you know, Ted and I have started collecting some of the ephemera associated with Eclipse. So 2 different sales catalogs, because, you know, Eclipse was trying to break into the book market as well.
So again, innovating.
Yeah. And then along the way, the last page in our little ashcan is done by Mac Fraga. He was a production designer, probably 2 or 3 before me. And we're just going to run through it really quick. But this 1987 catalog, I simply love. I think he's the best art director designer to work at Eclipse. I mean, the logo all blown out. Here's the back. So interesting info you can get from these guys.
Go back one.
Yeah.
That's signed.
Yeah.
Right?
No, I mean it was printed.
Oh, it's printed. Oh,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
thought those were signed.
No, that's their signature being printed. So this is his layout. You know, you got the books, the descriptions, graphic albums. Chris Ware's major work.
Excuse me, what's that George and Tom thing?
Didn't come out.
Huh?
Never happened.
Oh, this one. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, and that's what these are interesting too. You'll find these little projects.
Let's put a pin in this for a second, just so we can think about. You know, Chris had the first Chris Ware book there, the Floyd Farlane, which is amazing. The Rocketeer, which had been published by Pacific Comics. Maybe a chance to kind of talk about that a little bit. So Pacific at the same time was doing creator-owned books. They were doing really cool books, in my opinion. I think books that really stand the test of time. And one of the one that has stand the test of time the most is Dave Stevens' Rocketeer, which was in Pacific Presents. It was an anthology. The other story, it was a two-story anthology. The other story was by Steve Ditko. So they were, at the time, Bill and Steve Shanis thought, okay, well, we'll have the famous Steve Ditko, and then we'll have an unknown, right? So they had Steve Ditko, and they had the unknown Dave Stevens, and of course the Dave Stevens property ended up being the one that everybody knows today. So why Pacific is important in Eclipse's story is Pacific went out of business. So and I could give you an hour on why that happened, but I won't. But just they went out of business, and Eclipse inherited a number of their titles. And so a lot of what Eclipse published in this era, this sort of like late 80s era, mid to late 80s era, is when picking up titles that Pacific was going to do, including Miracle Man. And so much of what we know Eclipse for were things that were actually commissioned by the Shanis brothers. The Rocketeer and Miracle Man being the 2 most famous. The Rocketeer, what Eclipse had the right to do was collect those Pacific stories. And so this was done, again, as a trade paperback. You can probably tell from the orientation of it, it's not a comic book size trade paperback. So this is one of the early times taking a comic book and sizing it up into that traditional kind of European graphic novel size. Again, Eclipse was certainly not the first to do that, but early adopter of that. And this was available, again, as trade paperback, hardcover, signed and numbered hardcover. The Rocketeer movie came out around this time.
That's one of my memories too, is Dean having us sticker the book to make it like $2 more expensive.
Yeah.
Because the movie was coming out.
Right. And those Eclipse covers that we kind of, the Dave Stevens covers that we kind of skipped over, there was some part of, and I'm not privy to the details, but there was some part of Dave's deal with Eclipse that he agreed to do some covers for their other titles. So there's an Airboy cover, there's a Mr. Monster cover, there's some others. And those have become the most valuable Eclipse
They're
comics.
crazy. There's a bubble now that's huge on those things.
The only ones that come close are the Miracle Man issues, and so those are also quite valuable. The truth is that one of the nice things about the Eclipse Index, if you like it and you like some things I'm telling you, the vast majority of this stuff you can find inexpensively.
Right.
So, there are some exceptions. The Dave Stevens covers, the Miracle Man, a few others. I haven't looked at it, but my assumption is Floyd Farland is probably also expensive.
It's dropped down. It's about $20 now.
Okay.
The trivia I know about Floyd is that when Chris Ware won the Genius Grant, I believe, or MacArthur Grant, when he was winning a grant with some money, Chip Kidd had to contact whoever bestowed this grant and said, no, this wasn't really his first work. Like, talk it down. Because, like, Chris Ware did not want this because Jimmy Corrigan was the genius one.
Yeah, my assumption is right. He would prefer that we not know about
we
it.
forget about this. But he used to buy these so he could destroy them. I don't know if he does that anymore.
So,
The Georgia, Georgia Talk, was that Milton Knight? Who's the
It looks like to me. The Hugo guy?
I can't.
That's a cartoonist from out of Missouri. What was the guy's name?
It says here, I can read it a little bit. It says McFarlane, Dennis McFarlane.
Yeah.
Oh.
Seth MacFarlane. Yeah. Okay.
I don't know any. Other than it was not published, I have no other information.
I mean, look at this 3D.
Yeah. So again,
layout.
I want to take a minute here too. Sorry, Chris, but
No, you're fine.
a couple of things. So 3D comics, I don't know if you know, they were pioneered by Joe Kubert, which is an interesting piece of comics history. So he did Mighty Mouse in 3D. It was crazy successful. He did it with a friend of his, Norman Marr, which I think is how you say it. And he had a royalty deal, which was unusual for the time. And so he made a lot of money. Joe Kubert made good money. So did Norman from 3D comics. Like these things do, even back then, that was a short-lived fad. So it wasn't popular for very long, but it was popular for a little bit. Dean brought it back. And he did lots of 3D comics. There are lots of 3D comics. So I'm not a fan, but if you like them, you like them. They are effective.
They're tough to see sometimes.
Most of the effects are done by Ray Zone, so they're of quality. So if you like 3D, the ones that I've looked at are good 3D. Another little interesting piece of trivia about the 3D books is Kat could not see 3D.
Oh, no.
I forget what the vision impairment is, but she could not see 3D. And so she printed a very small number in black and white. So there are 3D black and white versions of the 3D comics.
I believe there were 100 of each one signed and numbered.
Yeah, she signed them for sure.
Right.
Because they were done for her and people who had her visual impairment. And those are far and away the hardest. I've never seen one.
I've only seen one and I didn't get it.
I do want to point out Captain EO.
Yeah, nice.
So, this is, again, my assumption here is that, Dean's trying to find things that'll make some money so he can do the things he loves about. Captain EO, for those of you that don't know, was a Michael Jackson ride at Disneyland. It was in 3D, so it worked out good because the ride was in 3D, so it worked out good for Dean to do a 3D comic. And it came in multiple formats. This is the comic size. There were other formats available as well. So more... the Forgotten Horrors may or may not have been published. I have not been able to find that one. I do want to talk about manga quickly. So Eclipse was not the first U.S. publisher to bring manga over, but they were one of the first. I don't know this definitively, but I think I Saw It, which was published by Last Gasp, was the first. Could be wrong. But what Eclipse did, I Saw It was published in a trade paperback format. What Eclipse did was they took the manga and they reformatted it for comic books. So they weren't published in trades. They certainly weren't published in the way that we think of manga today. They were published as U.S. comics. They of course were flopped so that they read for a Western audience, and they were reformatted to comic books. And these were really long-running series for Eclipse. So we're talking about 30, 40 issues for these three. There was one more called Xenon, and something happened. So these were done with Viz. They were Viz titles, and you can see they're Viz Comics. And so something happened. They were. My assumption is they were successful because they ran for a long time. Eclipse announced that they were going to do a bunch more. And so there are, if you look at the Comics Journal of that era, there were plans for Eclipse to do more books with Viz. Something happened. And so Viz decided to do it on their own. And of course, that's worked out okay for them in the US. Even when they took it over, they were still trying to figure out, like, how are Westerners going to read these comics? So they kept playing with format. They really stuck with the comic size for a while. They colorized some of them. They did perfect bound editions. They did trade paper. And eventually they get on the doing, hey, why don't we just do it the way we do it in Japan?
Yeah.
And, the rest is history, right? So
I like the international tagline too.
yeah.
I don't know if I remember that.
Yeah. I mean, you gotta love it. Like they had three. They had some others,
They're
but they had.
international.
Yeah, they had. So yeah.
I like this layout a lot too.
Yeah.
I mean, the last gap that I saw it, Leonard Righterson's Comics had done a version of that and Barefoot Cat.
Oh, okay.
It bombed.
Right.
You know, Leonard Righteson was bigger than him.
Yeah.
It bombed and it got picked up.
Oh,
Oh, by last guy.
interesting.
There's a book I translated manga. There's a book written by the founder of Viz in Japanese. There's quite a bit of information about his interactions.
Oh, I would love
I
to.
can't remember what it says.
If you have it translated, I would love to read it. Yeah, at the back.
The Guide Birds was published, there's a copy for $20 on Amazon, and there's also some photos of it on some blog.
Nice. I'll definitely love to get that info. I know we're running out of time. I do want to hit a couple of highlights on the comics.
What'd you say? 5 minutes? 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay.
6.
Okay. So the whole point of our book is kind of give you an idea of what we're doing with Eclipse Index. This is a passion project, of course. I actually wasn't intending to present it to an audience. I just wanted to work with
talked him
Chris.
into it.
So I was just doing this for myself. And
We tried to figure. First, it was going to be a zine.
yeah, go back to the comics for 1 second. Sorry.
Where do you want to go?
To the comics,
Okay.
the catalog. And so, Chris, I sort of begrudgingly did this because Chris is my partner in this. I want him to be happy. But the idea behind the book is that I'm going to read every single thing that Eclipse published, and then we're going to have an index, alphabetical index. But what I'm doing with is it's not just plot summaries, because who needs to read that, right? That's dull. That's dull as dirt. There are some plot summaries, but what I'm doing is I'm looking at the history of, so let's say Airboy, for example. I'm looking at the entire history of Hillman and the way they published Airboy. I'm looking a little bit at the creators of those original Airboy comics. I'm, of course, looking at the Eclipse comics. I'm looking at the history of those writers. So like Chuck Dixon, where did he go? Because that was his first, primarily his first ongoing series. And
You're sourcing interviews from.
Yeah, and so what I'm doing
Comics
is
Journal?
I went through Amazing Heroes and Comics Journal from this era. I went page by page and put post-it notes on every single time an Eclipse title was mentioned. And so I'm using that as source material for interviews, news things. That's why I know about some of the things that weren't published. And so it's this very obsessive look at Eclipse, but I'm also using it as an opportunity. For example, in the 3D comics, I talk about Joe Kubert and his partner Norman. I talk about Ray Zone. So it's a chance for me to talk a little bit about the broader history of comics as well. Because I was writing it for myself, and wasn't necessarily expecting people to read this. If you do buy one and you read it, I hope that you'll come to it and understand that it's done with passion. I did do an editorial pass. I did a proofreading pass. But I have not had another set of eyes on it other than Chris.
Right, we haven't had a professional.
And so it's not.
proofreader,
It's. I would say it's maybe
It's a
not.
fanzine.
It's hopefully not amateurish, but it's a step above.
Right.
So that's what it is. And I could tell you lots of things about these titles, but I'm not going to because eventually we'll publish them. But this kind of gives you, I think, an interesting look at the diversity again of Eclipse, all kinds of crazy stuff. Miracle Man is, of course, if you know anything about Eclipse, you'd know Miracle Man, and its long, interesting history. Okay, what else we got, Chris?
We got time for questions?
Yeah, I got one.
All
Let's
right.
hear about the tragic final day.
Well, so
We weren't there, but
yeah, I wasn't
we
there, but I
know.
do have a little history with it because as I said, I worked for Jim Lee, and when I worked for Jim Lee, the bankruptcy auction happened, and Jim and John Nee, who were running the company, that it would be funny if I bid on it for them. And so I was on the phone call in the bankruptcy auction, and I forget what Jim said I could spend $50,000 or something. McFarlane wanted it because he was in a dispute with Neil, and it was complicated. It's a 2-hour conversation, but Todd McFarlane wanted it for other reasons, and they, it was two rich guys, Todd and Jim. Todd wanted it more, and so I was on that call, so I'm that part of the history. And then when I worked for Todd McFarlane, he wanted to sort of put his footprint on things that he had purchased. So Bo Smith and I put together a comic that is impossible to find called Total Eclipse, which is essentially a new stories for characters like Airboy and Skywolf that we did just with pinups and a little bit of text. And so that was Todd kind of saying, hey, I bought this stuff. I better like figure out what I'm going to do with it. Ultimately, none of those things ever happened. It was just it was a promotional comic that we did, extremely rare, impossible to find. And if people only care about it because Miracle Man's in it a little bit. So,
What happened to the major characters?
so most of it they didn't know.
Some of it can't.
Yeah, most of it, and that's
Good question.
but to answer your question, because they were creator-owned titles, most of it Eclipse didn't own. So when Todd bought it, he really didn't buy much because David Boswell owned Reed Fleming, right? Even Airboy, I published Airboy at IDW. It was owned by Chuck and the artist. It wasn't owned by Eclipse, and so really Todd wasn't buying a whole heck of a lot.
Did he think he was, you thought?
It was really unclear at the time, and we could have a conversation privately about why he did it, but I don't think he cared. And you have to remember, this is the height of Image. These guys are wealthy beyond all imagination, and this is truly pocket change for them. So whether it just didn't matter to him. If it could have helped him with his situation that he was in, then it was worth the whatever he paid, $50,000, $75,000. Obviously, a lot of money for us, but like at that time for them, nothing.
One more question?
Curious about the Pacific to Eclipse transition. Like, how does that work? Was that just because the people involved knew each other? Or
Yeah.
Really contractual issues there that would make that tough?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, they certainly had to sign new contracts, and I think that's why Dave Stevens ended up doing those covers. Because my suspicion is that Dean probably said, "Hey, we'll do this," because we look at Rocketeer through today's eyes, right? I published Rocketeer at IDW as artist editions and all these like different ways in the movie. When Pacific was folding, Rocketeer was liked. Dave was certainly admired as an artist, but it wasn't hugely commercially successful. I suspect he probably went to Dave and said, "Yeah, I'll do it, but you got to do 5 covers," right? It would be my guess. So there were certainly new contracts done. I think there's a little bit of bad blood. I know the Shanus brothers quite well. They've lived in San Diego. I'm in San Diego. I actually saw Steve Shanus a couple of weeks ago. I had him sign my Pacific Comics Companion that tomorrow's published. But yeah, there would have been new contracts. But at that time, it's not like today where there would have been 20 options for those projects. Like there were very few publishers. Fantagraphics was not the size that they are today. I don't remember exactly who was around then, but it would have been places like First or Kamiko, not necessarily places that were doing that kind of work.
That's an okay question.
Yeah, at the back.
How much is the flood destroyed?
Say again?
The flood that you talked about, like you said inventory. I remember an old comic where Pat wrote a letter about it and editorial, but
Yeah, I don't know how much it was destroyed because the truth is most copies of a book are distributed. So it would only be the publisher inventory.
I used to go to antique stores around the area, and I always saw copies of Bogey that were water damaged.
So Eclipse did have a significant mail order business. So they did do direct-to-consumer mail orders. So they were bringing in maybe a little more than, say, I would have at IDW because we didn't do that. But publishers distribute, 90 to 95%. But it was a real amount.
Weren't they working on a Ditko biography that also got destroyed during that one?
I don't know. That's a good question.
There was a
If-
mistake.
They
Yeah.
were as a biography index, which I contributed to.
Oh, nice. Okay.
And I always thought, what's this? There's some flood damage. It must have been really bad though. 'Cause
Oh, it was a for real, like I said, once in a lifetime kind of like.
There was also a biography where Cat started talking to Ditko's high school friend, and that was the end of his involvement.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, he of course
I
wouldn't
can see
like
that.
Yeah, Kat, she did some Will Eisner books, and so she was a comics historian. In the early days of that. I wish we talked a little more about Kat because she really was an integral part of the company. And before she joined Eclipse, she was writing a column for the Comic Buyer's Guide that I mentioned at the beginning called Fit to Print,
Right.
and it was very confessional. She was talking about her own life. She was talking about her love of comics, and so
Appeared on page 9 every issue.
yeah, and that then would when she joined Eclipse, that would continue. It would be
Cat helped me out. I had a mini comic, and she helped us sell out
Yeah.
It was called Penguins in Bondage. She said 8 pages.
Yeah. So yeah,
of
that's
fire-
that's
8 pages of
yeah.
fire starter.
Right.
Her negative review led to us complete self.
Yeah, and again, and she pulled no punches, as we mentioned, with our own personal experience. But she was truthful. She did bring eyeballs in an era where it was hard to learn about things like that. She was doing that. She wrote a monthly column called Penumbra that appeared on the inside front cover of most Eclipse comics. And she's an important part of comics history. She I think is in the Eisner Hall of Fame.
She would
She
have to be, I
certainly won an
think.
Inkpot
Yeah.
Award. She has been recognized.
So last one we'll give away. Who can spell her last name?
I can.
Okay, I saw your. Oh,
Okay, all right.
YRONWODE.
Congratulations.
You got it.
So we don't. I mean, the volume 1 is A and B of Eclipse Publications.
This is only a this is
Right.
only-
Who
this
knows
is
if it'll
only a
come
couple,
out? This
right.
is an ashcan. I wanted something printed, a limited edition 100 numbered ashcan, and we're going to be selling these at the signing after this. If you are so inclined, they're $10. Who knows?
This is a sampler, so that my Airboy entry that Chris just designed recently, it was over 100 word pages,
Right.
and it was 120 design pages. So that alone would be its own book for most things. But so the A and B book is probably going to be about 500 pages when we have it done, and then the idea would be there would be 5 volumes, and then maybe a 6th volume where we would talk about things like the trading cards and talk about they did some music albums and some other wacky things. So yeah. So thanks so much for being
Yeah,
here.
thank
We really
you,
appreciate
everybody.
it. So.